Just about there with the technology set up. Okay, I think we've got it. Hope everybody is having a nice week this week. Whether you're here on Zoom or on YouTube.
Very good. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
Thank you.
All right. Well, you know, the technology's working. We've got people here. Why should I make you wait just because other people haven't logged in? Let's go ahead and get things rolling. Excuse me. So we are picking up our story of the Exodus. And in this next part of our story, we are beginning to leave. More specifically, we are at the threshold of truly passing beyond the border. It might have been expected that when we were marching out of Egypt after the final plague, and the Egyptians were telling us to hurry up and leave, that was the end of the drama. Of course not. So in chapter 14 here in the book of Exodus, we are going to be looking at the drama that happens at the edge of the sea, at the edge of our moving past where the Egyptians can follow us. Just as a little aside, although we don't really have the time to go into it today, I will be referring to the sea as either the sea or Yam Suf, the Hebrew name for that particular body of water, or the Sea of Reeds. The text itself calls it Yam Suf, or just Hayam, the sea. Yam Suf means the Sea of Reeds. There is a great deal of evidence to suggest that this is an inland sea along the Sinai Peninsula border with Egypt proper, not the Red Sea. I know many people would love it to be the Red Sea because it seems more dramatic, but it seems unlikely that it was the Red Sea just by the route that was being taken, as we'll see described here at the beginning of our text. This in no way diminishes the miracle. Something I'll be talking about a little bit more during my sermon this coming Shabbat. We shouldn't feel that God's power is only great if God happens to be moving the largest body of water around. If so, then we would want God to be moving us through the Mediterranean. Instead, it is about the miracle that allowed us to escape into our freedom. And however that miracle happened, whether it was with a big body of water or a smaller body of water, should not diminish the miracle. The same way, we say that the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, which is among the more modest mountains in the world, does not diminish the gift of the Torah. So with that caveat, let's go ahead and begin to see the tale at the seashore. Verse 1 from chapter 14. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp before Pit Hariot, between Migdol and the sea. Before Baal Zephon, you shall encamp facing it by the sea." So we're essentially doubling back on the route that we were taking as we left the main area of Egypt. And what's going to happen when this happens? Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, they are astray in the land. The wilderness has closed in on them. Right? They're lost. Remember, Pharaoh at this point still thought that perhaps we were only going out and having our little worship party, and then that we were planning to come back. With us moving in circles, it seems that we are, one, not coming back, and two, would be easy pickings for Pharaoh and his people to come and either kill us or return us. Verse 4. Then I will stiffen Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, that I may gain glory through Pharaoh and all his host. and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so, meaning that the people were led in this roundabout way. The notion that God is arranging the events at this point, again, look for previous study videos where we talked about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart as being giving him the courage to do what he wanted, as opposed to giving in for illegitimate reasons. It's really something here when God is hardening Pharaoh's heart is giving Pharaoh the bravery to do what Pharaoh wants to do. The fact is, Pharaoh could have still chosen to do differently had he been a different person. But that's not going to be our focus for today. Verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his courtiers had a change of heart about the people and said, "What is this we have done, releasing Israel from our service?" So we see here that it is their decision to go after us, even though God may have given them the courage to have the ability to make that decision. Ultimately, it is still Pharaoh deciding to attack. Verse 6 and 7, he ordered his chariot and took his men with him. He took 600 of his picked chariots and the rest of the chariots of Egypt with officers in all of them. This is a large force of rapid strike troops. Verse 8, the Lord stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he gave chase to the Israelites, as the Israelites were departing defiantly. The Egyptians gave chase to them, and all the chariot horses of Pharaoh, his horsemen, and his warriors overtook them encamped by the sea, near Pit Hahariot, before Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites caught sight of the Egyptians advancing upon them. Greatly frightened, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, "Was it for want of graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt? Is this not the thing we told you in Egypt, saying, 'Let us be, and we will serve the Egyptians'? For it is better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." All right, so let's make sure we get the complaint here understood. The Israelites are up against the shore of the sea, and they see the Egyptians advancing on them in full battle formation. They are upset. They are afraid. This looks like it's going to be the end. So they cry out to God, and they say to Moses, "Why did you do this?" Right? Look, all of your talk of freedom, all of your talk of liberation, all of your talk of God's power, why did you bring us out here? Because we're just going to die. So did you have to bring us here because it was easier to bury us? Why not just leave us in Egypt, where they could have buried us if we wanted to be dead, we could have died there. Again, they say explicitly, if you'd left us there, we could have just been servants. At least we would have been alive. We would have been slaves, but we would have been living slaves. But you have led us all to a mass death. Hopefully you can understand this feeling among the Egyptians and how betrayed they must have felt at this moment, seeing no option, seeing a sea in front of them, seeing the army behind them. What are they going to do? Verse 13. But Moses said to the people, "Have no fear. Stand by and witness the deliverance which the Lord will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will battle for you. Hold your peace." Hold your peace is perhaps a little bit of a misleading term in the English. It's not the Hebrew word peace, of course, but basically it means be silent or be quiet. So Moses is telling the people, don't worry. God is going to defeat the Egyptians. All of that army up there, it's not going to be a problem for us. So just shut up. Verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. And you lift up your rod and hold out your arm over the sea and split it, so that the Israelites may march into the sea on dry ground. And I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians so that they go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his warriors, his chariots and his horsemen. Let the Egyptians know that I am the Lord, when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So that is the plan that God is giving to Moses. Then goes on to be executed. The pillar of fire goes to the back to protect the Israelites as the sea begins to split. They travel through. The Egyptians follow stupidly and then, or bravely, depending upon how you want to look at it, and then, of course, are destroyed when the waters collapse over them. The wheels of their chariot not being a great choice for driving through the lake bed. Okay. Any questions on the overall text that we are talking about so far before I get into some of the specific points that we'll be looking at in more detail? Or comments?
One thing, one of my translation that I'm looking at in verse 7, it mentions that they're teams of 3 on the chariots. That's in the Fox.
Yes.
Have you ever seen the movie Dr. Zhivago? And there's the Troika, 3 horses and a full gallop. These are wonderful. A Troika is great if you want to go at a full gallop over dry land or over ice, but not so much in the mud.
Right. Now the phrase, Shalishim, that's being translated in the Fox as being 3, here is being translated as officers. And sometimes that happens in the Hebrew where the name of the rank is linked to the counting of the soldiers in a particular arrangement. And having...
But the other way would be if it's like a Chinese chariot, which has 2 horses, a team of 3 officers in it. One to drive, one who balancing, and the other who has an arrow.
Right. That was the main purpose. Sword. Right. That was the main purpose of the chariots were in fact as mobile artillery platforms that they would swing in, fire, and then leave before anyone could retaliate. So it could mean officers. It could mean specifically they were fully equipped with all of the usual 3 people on the back. We don't know precisely because of the technology has moved on and we didn't preserve the idiom of the chariot team technical rankings. But definitely it means fully equipped at that point. But in any event, as I mentioned, we do see later on in the text that chariots were not great for going into the seabed after the Israelites. Really good for, like you mentioned, the wide open areas that Egypt would normally try to have their battles on. Not so good if there's anything like terrain. Any other questions or comments on this part of chapter 14? All right, so I want to draw your attention to the phrase that's going to occupy most of our attention, although we needed the backstory before getting here. You can see in verse 15 that God seems to be rebuking Moses, right? Matitz ak Eli, right? Why are you crying out to me? Now, what exactly does that mean? Is he saying that Moses shouldn't be crying out? Is he saying that Moses shouldn't be crying out? Is he saying Moses shouldn't be crying out to me, meaning to God? What exactly is happening here? Or is he just saying in general, this is not the time for crying out? And then reading the second half of the verse, tell the Israelites to go forward. All of these are options we're going to have to explore. But there's one big question that I want to get on the top of your mind, which is, did Moses cry out? Right? We see Moses crying or saying to the people, have no fear, be brave, everything is going to be fine, which is not exactly what, titzak, the crying out, would normally seem to represent. Right? Titzak, the crying out, is usually a plea. The only time we've seen crying out was back up here in verse 10. But who was crying out in verse 10? It was the Israelites, Bnei Israel. It wasn't Moses crying out. So why is Moses being addressed by God for crying out? And what is the intention behind God's statement? We'll leave it neutral at the moment, his statement to Moses at this time. So let's go ahead and see what our commentaries have to say about this concern. So we begin, Ibn Ezra, there are those who say that Moses was screaming out to God. This is not correct, since he already spoke to him saying, I will be glorified through Pharaoh. Right? Moses already knew what was going to happen. That's why Moses has such confidence in the line right before God tells him, don't cry out to me. So Moses is not crying out to God. It only speaks of Moses, who is representative of all of Israel, because the Israelites screamed out to God. So God spoke to Moses, saying to the Israelites through Moses, why are you crying out to me? So in Ibn Ezra's opinion, this verse is trying to lay out that God is rebuking the Israelites themselves, but he is doing it through Moses, because Moses is the representative. The same way that you might use the name of a leader of a particular country as being representative of the whole country. Where do we see that? Oh, right, Pharaoh. Throughout the entire story, Pharaoh both represents himself as an individual as well as the entire nation of Egypt. So Ibn Ezra's argument is that's what's happening here. God is not complaining about Moses crying out. Moses didn't cry out, and we didn't see Moses cry out because Moses knew there was no need to cry out. This is just Moses being treated as the representative. And indeed, Chizkuni has a great deal to agree with this opinion. According to the plain meaning, Moses was quite sure that the Israelites would be helped and saved. Had God not told him, I will deal very severely with Pharaoh. The question was addressed to the Israelites through Moses. The Torah is full of examples when God speaks to Moses as representative of the whole Jewish nation. He is taking issue. Now the question of why is there a godly rebuke here? He is taking issue with the fact that the Israelites were complaining instead of displaying a little bit of faith by wading into the sea. God tells Moses to command them to get moving. He had already told them that he would fight on their behalf. They should therefore have been certain that God would not let the Egyptians defeat them. So the reason why God is interjecting at all and objecting here is, why are you crying out? Start walking forward into the water. That was the intention behind this line, and that we shouldn't make too much of a deal about Moses being the object of the verb, because Moses was just representative of the people. And it was the people that had the problem, not Moses, with regards to going forward and having faith in God. Make sense?
Josh?
Yes.
Yes. Josh, maybe there's a certain kind of, I don't want to say resentment from God's standpoint, but you've gone through all these plagues over the year, right? To the slaying of the firstborn. Now they're out in the wilderness by the Sea of Reeds, but they've always had a pillar of fire, which is not normal, to say the least, that they're following. I mean, it's conceivable that God is saying, really, what do I have to do to convince these people? Because they always, there was security in Egypt. Even if you were a slave, you got food.
All right.
So I can see. Go ahead.
Right. That seems to be the crux of both Ibn Ezra and Chizkuni's opinion, which is the people are making a major mistake here. The people are saying that they don't trust that God is truly going to save them. In fact, the people are focusing on Moses. Right? Even as they cry out to God, they complain, why did you bring us out here to die? And that seems to imply that they cannot imagine despite everything that's happened, that there is a way out, that there is a solution, that there is some thing that can save them at this time. We, the omniscient reader, of course, and with 3,000 years behind us, know that God is about to do something, but they seem to be questioning that. And that, according to these first commentators, is what gives us that interesting little exchange in our verses. However, that's not the only way to read it. Right? Ramban, Nachmanides, has a different take. Because he points out, why do you, with a singular verb, cry out to me? When we look back at our phrase, just to make sure we're seeing it, you can see that the verb that's being used here is in the singular you form. Remember that Hebrew, unlike English, does differentiate between you, one person, and you, a group. So God is not saying, why do you all cry out to me? God is saying, why do you, one person, cry out to me? And indeed, he thus says, according to the sages, God is addressing Moses in specific. Although scripture does not mention before this that Moses prayed, apparently it is included in the crying out of the Israelites in verse 10. Right? It said that the Israelites cried out to God. We must assume that Moses was joining in, because here God is definitely telling him something specific. And what's the issue? Although God had told him earlier, I will be glorified through Pharaoh, Moses did still not know how to conduct himself now that they were caught at the edge of the sea with the enemy close behind. God replied, why do you cry out as if in distress? Why do you not simply ask me what to do? Right? The crying out, as I mentioned earlier, in Hebrew implies a great plea, a great wail of distress, of help, as though you're not sure there will be help. You know, the person who is drowning cries out. Shouting would be sort of an alternative, or asking would have been an alternative. That Moses, according to Ramban, should have simply said, all right, God, you got us here. I know you're going to get us out of it, but could you tell us what to do next? Because right now I'm not seeing the plan. Not, I don't believe there's a plan, or I don't know if you can get us out of this, but I'm just asking for the next detail. You've given me lots of information so far, but not enough to tell me what to do when I'm standing on the edge of the water. So fill me in. Ramban is saying that God was chastising Moses, criticizing him for not making that additional step of not saying, just fill me in. But instead, it seemed like Moses indeed was in distress, that Moses didn't know that there would be a rescue, as opposed to the question of just how there would be a rescue. So hopefully you can see how Ramban is reading that.
Rabbi,
Yes.
did Rambam ever say that Moses, understanding spiritual growth, kept going as it moved forward and had different experiences with Hashem? Did he ever mention anything like that? I thought I heard you taught it one time to us that you could see the growth in Moses also through this process, but I wasn't sure if Rambam had anything about that.
Well, many commentators indeed talk about Moses developing as a person over the course of his career, the 40 years that he spends in intimate connection with God, that he develops both personally as well as a leader. So indeed, we could just simply be seeing this is an early stage of his development, and God is saying, "What are you, stupid? Come on, just ask me what to do. Don't ask if I'll do." And that seems to be Ramban's opinion right here. Now, Tur HaAruch is going to bring these together and try and lay out how both Ibn Ezra and Ramban are bringing interesting points, and then try and move us a little bit farther forward. So Ibn Ezra, the one we just saw, points out that Moses had not been crying out, seeing that God had already told him that he would bring severe judgment on Pharaoh and all those with him. Meaning God meant, what is the point of the Israelites crying out to me? Meaning that he was focusing on the Israelites. Moses in this instance is addressed as the representative of the whole people who had been crying out, like we talked about in the first comment. Ramban, who gave us our third comment, points out that if even Ezra were correct, the people, not having been given the assurance that Moses had been given, would have been entitled to cry out. Why does God criticize them? And so earlier in Ramban's text, what he was implying is that, look, Moses knew the plan, but that doesn't mean the Israelites knew the plan. So if God was criticizing the Israelites for crying out through the representative of Moses, like even Ezra suggested, that's a little unfair. Instead, our sages comment that Moses himself was indeed crying out, that is to say, offering an urgent prayer, something that was the appropriate thing to do under the circumstances. He prayed for guidance. God simply criticized the nature of the prayer Moses had offered. He told Moses that instead of uttering a sort of complaint, he should simply have asked God how to act in this new set of circumstances, a situation for which he had not been prepared. Seeing that I had given you an assurance that I would deal with Pharaoh, all you had to do was ask for guidance, how to act in this situation. So he's bringing a summary of these two different opinions and showing that, again, the main issue was about what Moses was supposed to be doing, not if something was going to be happening. But there is, I think, a great insight here that oftentimes when we are afraid or disappointed, we will rush to a complaint rather than for clarification. That we will rush to say, why is this happening? Or why is this happening to me? Or why didn't you, whether it be God or even another person, do X, Y, and Z, and rush straight into that attack mode. Instead, we get a little bit of an insight here that not just in our relationship with God, of course, but also with perhaps each other, we should ask for more information, for guidance, rather than immediately leap to the attack, leap to a complaint. So that sort of rounds out much of the argument about who was crying out and why. But we still have the second half of that verse. The second half of that first phrase, which is the Eli, to me. The question is, why did God say Eli? Because we could have read that same verse that we've had so far. Then the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out? And be done. The words to me must be adding additional information. But the question is, what information could that be? What is it about the to me that gives us something to understand that would have been lacking if it had not been included in the text? So we're going to begin with that part with Rabbeinu Bachya. According to the plain meaning of these words, the words to me means that the matter does not depend on God at all, but on Israel. Meaning, why are you calling out to me? Right? What do you think I am going to do at this point? What do you think I have to do with what happens next? And that may sound a little surprising, but that's why he takes the second half into the next part of the commentary. Speak firmly to the children of Israel, and they will march forward. God hinted that as soon as the Israelites would move forward, the sea would part for them to let them through. They only needed to demonstrate a little faith by moving forward. So here, what Rabbeinu Bachya is emphasizing in the inclusion of the word to me is it's not wrong that the people were distressed. What's wrong is that they were thinking that it was God that would make the next move. Instead, the next move, as we see in the structure of that verse itself, just clicking back to remind you, right, that the next move is to tell them to go forward, tell them to advance. And that is the next move, which has nothing to do with me. Obviously, it has a lot to do with what God will do next, but it has to be the people and then God's reaction, rather than God and the people's reaction. This is, of course, trying to begin to transform us from being a purely submissive, reactive people to ones that will act with faith that God will complement our actions, provided we are moving in the right direction. In this case, the right direction was to get your feet wet. And indeed, Rashi is going to build off this as well. There is no mention that he, meaning Moses, prayed to God concerning this. But this teaches us that Moses stood in prayer, meaning just stood in prayer. Whereupon God said to him, "It is no time now to pray at length when Israel is placed in trouble," meaning the issue that we see with regards to God complaining to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me?" is now is not the time for crying out. Now is not the time for lengthy prayer. Now is the time, as we'll see, for action. Another explanation, since there is more to be said from this, upon me rests the matter and not you. The idea contained in this explanation is similar to what is expressed elsewhere in Isaiah 45, concerning my sons and concerning the work of my hands, will you command me? So this is trying to say, in opposition to Rabbeinu Bachya's insight, that the "why are you calling out to me" are almost two separate phrases. Why are you calling out, meaning why are you standing there praying? And to me is the rebuke, meaning your prayers are not what's going to make this happen. I'm going to make this happen. I'm the one who's in charge of this. And Moses, as much as I love you, you cannot give me orders. Indeed, Siftei Chachamim, as we've talked about before, a super commentary on Rashi tries to draw our attention to why Rashi would have said this. The trope, the cantillation marks under cry out, is a tipcha, showing that it is not connected to me, meaning that there is a break between one and the next. This conveys that to me means this thing depends on me. So if we were to go back to our verse again, it would be an English rendered like this, according to the Rashi's interpretation. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out? It's me, right? I've got it. It's on me." And then tell the Israelites to go forward. So there would be a period or some other form of strong punctuation to separate the crying out and the translation of the Elai of "to me." What do we think? Because we now have two interpretations that are in direct opposition. Rabbeinu Bachya says that "to me" means it doesn't depend on God. It just depends on Israel moving forward with faith. And Rashi seems to be implying it only depends on God, because only God can do what needs to be done.
Gosh, Rabbi, that's a very interesting question, because you need both to get it done. You need God to get it done, and you need people to have faith to get it done. So it would be hard for me to answer that question, because one cannot work without the other. If Hashem wouldn't have done it, and if the people wouldn't have had the faith to move forward, nothing would have happened, to me,
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons I brought this, is because it represents the often false impression that the different commentaries are contradicting one another. It looks like they are saying the opposite things. It only depends on Israel. It only depends on God. But as you put it, it depends on both, right? Yes, right now at this moment, the next action depends upon Israel, the act of stepping forward and showing some faith. But ultimately, it depends upon me, God, to fulfill the miracle that will be necessary for you to get through. You walking forward into the water when it's not the right time, when it's not the right sea, when it's not the right place, don't expect the water to part for you. If I lost my watch in a lake, I shouldn't just start walking forward confident that God will split the waters for me, because it just needs my faith before God will act. But conversely, we need to recognize that, well, it does need God for this to actually act. Those two pieces go together, even though it looks like each of them are interpreting that phrase in mutually contradictory ways. And this just shows the complexity and the depth of commentary in Jewish law and Jewish thinking. It's not so simple to simply say, this is what the word means, and we're done. This is why we argue, this is why we discuss, and this is why we can learn more than one thing from even a single word in the Torah. In fact, we're going to learn more than 2 things because we're not done with this yet. So moving on to our next set of commentary on the second page, we can get the understatement. The word to me, Eli, is difficult. Right? This is a tricky concept of how it fits into the sentence. Who else was Moses supposed to cry out to, if not to God? We find both in Jonah as well as in Psalms that in times of distress, one is supposed to cry out to God, as did both Jonah and David successfully. So on the one hand, you might have thought, why are you crying out to me? Was like God saying, why are you crying out to me? What do you want me to do? Who thinks that when there's trouble, you should talk to God? But we know when there's trouble, you're supposed to talk to God. On the other hand, if God meant that Moses indulged in too much prayer, which seemed to be what Rashi was saying, that would seem an unjustified criticism, as long as Moses' prayer hadn't been answered. But God, am I supposed to stop calling out in prayer before I've actually been relieved from my distress? If I am, in the midst of a war and ducking under a foxhole and there are bombs going off everywhere, do I say, please God, get me out of this and then stop while the bombs keep falling? Or do I keep praying until I'm actually saved from that situation? It seems that there's no such thing as too much prayer until the problem has been removed. Besides, we see from God's instruction in verse 16 that Moses was to raise his staff, that God did answer his prayer. So God is giving instructions at this point. So what's the big deal? If so, why did God ask Moses, why do you cry out to me? If those other reasons are not valid, and not valid ways to interpret that verse, then what should we get from this verse? What is God's answer? Speak to the children of Israel so that they move on, supposed to me. To understand the question, you have to see the answer. Were they supposed to move? Where were they supposed to move to? The Egyptians were behind them and the sea was in front of them. If God meant that they should move after they would observe the sea split, God should first have told Moses to raise his staff and afterwards have given the command that the Israelites were to move into the bed of sea. So even taking the interpretations we saw on our first page, Or HaChaim is trying to sharpen our understanding that it's not done, because there's still a question of sequence. Because if God was upset at crying out, or too much crying out, or crying out right now, then, and the Israelites were supposed to start walking forward, wouldn't it have been simply unreasonable to expect them to walk into the ocean, to walk into the water itself, the Yam? Wouldn't it have made more sense to have said, lift your staff, split the water, and then tell the people to walk forward? But as we saw from our text, which I'll flip back to again, the immediate response of why do you cry out to me is tell the Israelites to go forward. And it is only in the next verse that we get lift and split. So we still have this problem to deal with. Thankfully, we still have more commentary that might help us. Rashi first. There is nothing for the Israelites to do but to journey on, for the sea will not stand in their way. Their ancestors' merit and their own, and the faith they have placed in me, meaning God, so that they left Egypt, will suffice to divide the sea from them. So Rashi, building on his commentary in the previous text, is saying the Israelites already have the power to split the sea. God has already placed that in them, if you will, as a reward for both the ancestors, for them, as well as their own recent willingness to leave Egypt. So God does not need to tell them about the plan of the staff and the splitting and all of that. They should already recognize that the sea is not a barrier. It may look like a barrier, but it's not a barrier for people who are in the place that they are in. And thus, there was no need to reorder anything. What was needed was walking forward. And then the other details, all that would fall into place. Indeed, Siftei Chachamim goes ahead to try and explain this. If Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, moves on, you can make the sea split by raising your staff. But if they do not move on, the sea will not split, although you raise your staff over it. This is because the merit of their ancestors is effective to split the sea for them. Accordingly, why do you cry to me? Means as follows: do not think you can split the sea through your prayers. Rather, let them move on. That it is the movement that will split the sea, not the prayer that will split the sea. So what the Sifrei Chachamim is trying to say about Rashi's commentary about our text is that it is in fact contingent upon the motion of the people more than the lifting of the staff. The splitting of the sea is dependent upon their willingness to move forward, not on their prayers and not on the staff. And thus, the order of the lines makes perfect sense. The move forward, lift staff, ocean will split. That actually is a very important theological revelation, is this what the commentary is saying here. It is not just a out of sequence line of verses. Questions or comments?
Rabbi, the pulling of the staff, is it parallel to when the people are attacked by poisonous snakes and Moses raises his staff? It's not the staff that heals them, but it's by looking at the staff that their faith is strengthened.
Indeed, this commentary is arguing that the staff lifting in and of itself is not the main action, that it is the response to the true miracle, which is the people's faith that lets them walk forward. And thus, that is what gives power to the moment. The staff is more symbolic, if you will. But specifically in this case, it is symbolic after the motion of the people. Right? The action first, symbol second. As opposed to when you're talking about the raising of the standard of the bronze serpent to cure the people from the snakes, there was the symbol first, followed by the action, the people looking up and thinking of God and heaven. But in both cases, yes, this is definitely symbolic and not the main power that is causing anything to happen. But why would there be any hesitation at all? Why would there be this issue of what's happening? Why? I mean, like was already mentioned once today, the Israelites had already seen a year of miracles. They had already seen the power of God. They had seen the death of the firstborn. They had seen the pillar of fire, the cloud that guided them. Do they really have a reason for being hesitant? Well, Or HaChaim wants to give his own explanation. And this is following on from his earlier question of how do we understand this whole problem. We see in Shemot Rabbah, in the great collection of Midrashim, that Samael, who is the name of one of the angels that is on the side of strict justice, opposes the coming miracle, meaning the splitting, claiming that until very recently, the Israelites had worshipped idols just like the Egyptians. Thus, the Israelites were subject to the attribute of justice, meaning that the Israelites were not worthy of mercy. They were not worthy of compassion. They were not worthy of this miracle because they were still very recently idol worshippers themselves when they lived among the Egyptians. God, meaning Adonai, which represents the attribute of mercy, as we see throughout the narrative structure of the Tanakh, told Moses that the Israelites were addressing themselves to the wrong attribute in their prayers for help. They were crying out for justice when what they should have been crying out for was mercy. And that does often happen, that people will claim that their cause is just without realizing that, in fact, they perhaps lack enough merit to really move their case. And what they truly need is more compassion and less justice. While it was true that the attribute of mercy was anxious to perform a life-saving miracle on behalf of the Israelites, they had not yet qualified for such a miracle by their deeds. God advised Moses, speak to the children of Israel to perform an act of faith, such as entering the sea so that I can activate my attribute of mercy and perform the miracle I have in mind. Following such a demonstration of faith, Moses was to raise his staff to enable God to perform the splitting of the Sea of Reeds. When God said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me?" he meant the matter is altogether not in my hands. if and when Moses had spoken to the children of Israel and they had demonstrated the necessary measure of faith, only then raise your staff. This is what happened after Nachshon ben Aminadav walked into the sea up to his neck. So Nachshon is a figure that is mentioned parenthetically in other parts of the Torah as one of the princes of Judah, but is picked up on by the Midrash as having been the first person to truly walk into the water to show his faith. But more importantly than the Midrashic story, colorful though it is what Or HaChaim is trying to tell us about the sequence of events here, is that the people were hoping for justice, but justice wasn't going to cut it because they were not really blameless. They had done a lot of bad things, and we'll see they're about to do more bad things even once they're freed. So instead, they should be focusing on mercy and compassion. However, mercy is not given out just carte blanche all the time. Justice does have to have a say in the world, but sometimes a little extra mercy and compassion can be earned through extenuating circumstances, through mitigating effects of a person's righteous behavior. What would be a very fitting act of righteous behavior at this moment? Walking into the water, confident that God would save them. That would show that indeed they had moved away from their idols, they had moved away from Egyptian belief, they had moved away from all of the doubt that had been plaguing that country, both among the Egyptians and among many Israelites, and thus would be in a position to recognize the miracle that was about to happen, that they would be able to acknowledge it as a miracle and take advantage of the opportunity to flee Egypt and be saved. And that was realized once they began to move into the water and see that as an opportunity. Now, this can also lead to a more naturalistic understanding. Indeed, many commentators say that no miracle comes except through the miracle of the natural order. Rather than disrupting the world, it is fulfilling the world. And we can see that if the people walked into the sea, they might have noticed the water wasn't as deep as they thought. They might have noticed that the water doesn't drop off. They might have noticed that with the wind blowing, it was easy to find their way, and that this would be a difficult barrier for the Egyptians following them. But they would only notice that miracle of perfect timing of a low level of water that would save them but trap the Egyptians. They would only notice that if they put their toe in the water. They would never have realized that just standing on the edge of the water looking at it. And so with this idea, their step gives them the perspective to appreciate the miracle that was already being made, if you will, for them, but would have gone unnoticed, unrealized, and unhelpful if they had not had the willingness to at least test the waters to see if this was indeed the way God was going to have them be liberated. Questions or comments before we move to our concluding interpretation of Sforno?
I have a weird question that it is a little bit off topic, so bear with me.
Okay.
Kind of related. I find it interesting that being that they crossed over, the Jordan, and then when they came across the Mar, the what do you call that? Oh gosh.
The bitter water?
The bitter water. That's what I was looking for. Bitter water. They just didn't have the faith to believe that, that there could be a miracle there either. And I find that interesting because it's two different situations. So I would understand that they might think, yeah, that happened, but can God do this? Because we hear that in the past, but it's interesting how every area of their growth, because it was all a growth. But I find it interesting that they wouldn't have faith when they saw something so exceptional already done through water, not related to, the bitter waters. But I was just curious of your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, to be fair to them, and indeed we're going to see a little bit of this in Sforno in just a second, having faith doesn't always mean you know what to do. So even if the people had faith that there would be some solution, They were not seeing it yet, both here at the edge of the water as well as with the bitter waters. What's going to happen? Now, their sarcasm, their snide comments, oh, you brought us out here to die, that makes it hard to see the faith that the people had. And indeed, let me go ahead and read Sforno, because like I said, I think he brings this topic up very nicely. So God's question, the why do you cry out to me, seems at first glance redundant, seeing that Moses' outcry would have been perceived as part of the nation's outcry in verse 10. However, Moses' outcry had nothing to do with being afraid of the pursuing Egyptians. Right? Taking all the objections, right? He had already predicted the downfall and death of Pharaoh and his army as being so decisive that Egypt as a world power would never again pose a serious threat to the Jews. He had also told the people that God would do the fighting for them and that all they had to do was remain silent. Right? So there's no way that Moses could have been worried about those things the way the average people were. As we saw, even Ezra just takes Moses and makes him the representative, but Sforno wants to imply that Moses had a completely separate crying out that had its own content, its own issue, and which God was criticizing. Moses' outcry was one of concern with the rebellious attitude of the people, who not only were afraid, something that could be forgiven, but who had dared to be sarcastic in their hour of danger, ridiculing Moses' leadership to the point where he was afraid they would refuse to enter the sea when told to. God told Moses that he had no right to assume such a thing, that in fact, he was suspecting innocent people of lack of faith. So what Sforno is trying to do here is to take many of the threads that we've been working with and weave them together into a slightly different narrative, where the people come to the edge of the water, and Moses is there knowing full well what is about to happen, that the sea is going to split, the people will walk through it, all they have to do is step into the water, and then everything will happen, because that will show their faith, they have the merit, and everything will tick, 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 fall into place. But when the people begin to go, what are we going to do? Moses isn't so upset about the fear, but when they start getting sarcastic and snarky, and we brought us out here because there weren't enough graves, Moses gets angry at the people, something we see him do later on to his own detriment, and getting angry at them, he now thinks, well, what's the point of me telling them to walk in the water? There's no way they're going to walk into the water if they're arguing about you didn't have enough graves. So, we're ruined, right? God, what are we going to do? The people don't have enough faith. Because if I try and tell them to walk in, you can see what they're like. There's no way they're going to do it. And God is telling Moses, why are you calling out to me? Just tell them to go forward. They will do it. You're not giving them enough credit. They are prepared to do it. They just need the leadership. They just need you to show them to do it, to tell them to do it, and they will. Yes, they're obnoxious. Yes, they are sarcastic. Yes, they are really going to be annoying for the next 40 years. But that doesn't mean that they lack faith. It just means their faith is in need of guidance and proper direction. Because after all, having faith just in and of by itself could lead a person to jump off of a cliff believing that God will help them fly. But having real faith means you need guidance. And that is the union that's happening right here between Moses and the people. And that's the tension in their relationship that's going to lead to some amazing things over the next 40 years and some real problems over the next 40 years. Because each one is a little mistrustful of the other. The people are not fully behind Moses, even if they do have faith in God. And God does not believe that the people are fully behind God or that they are fully behind him. And that mistrust is going to be at the center of many of the worst episodes in our people's next 40 years of traveling through the wilderness, whether it be the golden calf, whether it be the failure with the quails, whether it be the failure of striking the rock. It is a mistrust between Moses and the people more than a mistrust of either of them and God. And to go back to Michelle's earlier question regarding the bitter waters, or indeed any of the other apparent signs of lack of faith, It may just be not that they doubt that God could do it, but that they haven't seen at that moment that Moses is prepared to show them how God will do it. Remember, going back to Skuni and the other arguments before, it is an issue of not so much if, but how. And sometimes it's the how that is the hardest thing to get our heads around. And it is the how that is often most essential. Faith is great, but if it doesn't have direction, it can lead you off a cliff. Faith with direction, on the other hand, that can cause the water to split. Any questions or final thoughts and comments?
No, that was a very good explanation. Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you. I so much of life, it is a question of not what's going to happen, but how do I get there?
Absolutely.
Thank you,
All right.
Rabbi.
Thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day. Those of you who are coming to Mishnah, see you tonight. Those who come to Pathways to Judaism, see you tomorrow afternoon at 6. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.